and just welcome you all again. We are at our monthly SenseMaking session. This is April 1st, 2024. And I and Curtis will be your facilitators today. I'm Amy Moritz, and Curtis Miller is going to be guiding us through the second half of our time together. We're both members of the Social System Mapping Community of Practice. And every third Monday, we turn our attention to models and methods that can enhance our sense-making skills in the social system mapping community of practice. And so Curtis and I will be sharing from our experience and learning, but we're also inviting you and hoping that you will share from your own experience and wisdom as well. And as always, we are grateful for the wisdom, energy, and generosity of Christine Capra. So Christine is the one who brings our community together. She's the initiator. She and her partner, Tim, are the developers of SumApp. And Christine is the visionary behind social system mapping. So with gratitude. And this community of practice, as it grows, we are all discovering new ways to grow with it and finding ways to participate alongside Christine and each other. And so typically Christine is doing this part, but y'all have me doing the welcome, because Christine has encouraged and is providing guidance to Curtis and I to share this sense-making leadership role with her. And so with gratitude to all allowing us to serve the community, and also thank you for being patient with Curtis and I as we learn our new roles. We're hoping that by the end of our 90 minutes together today, that you will leave inspired by a new sense of possibility. We hope that you meet some new people and that you feel very welcomed here. And we hope that you start to see how social system mapping can support a network in learning how to deal with complexity. And you're also going to get to practice a framework for exercising your sense-making muscle. So here's our agenda for today. We have two opportunities where we're going to go into breakout groups. And if for some reason you do not wish to participate in the breakout, I would ask you at this time to put a # in front of your name. Just edit your name on the Zoom feature. And that way, when Kara, who is doing our technical support, will know who to put into breakout rooms and who would wish not to participate. But shortly, I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves. Then I'll do an overview of some of the basics of social systems mapping. We'll have an opportunity to break up into groups. I'll then walk us through the theory of transformation for social system mapping. And then Curtis is going to share with us a model from human system dynamics called difference matrix. Some more opportunity to get into breakout. And my hope is that we've got a good 20 minutes or so at the end just for some open discussion and dialogue. I'd invite you as much as possible to hold your questions until we come to the opportunities where we pause for a minute. But if you've got something that's just burning and you need it answered right away so that we can continue, then feel free to interrupt. So Kara is going to put into the chat a link to these slides that I'm using. And I think if for some of you that have been on these types of sessions before, if you'll click through the slides till you get to this question, you're going to be presented with an opportunity to type in your name, your pronoun, your location, and maybe share with us a network that you are currently supporting. And if you'll do that now and hit the enter button when you're finished, we'll begin to see the screen change and your responses, and we can kind of see who's here on the Zoom call. Great, thank y'all. Wonderful. Anybody else? Anybody having trouble? Everybody's able to use the link. Thanks, Curtis. Mary. Wonderful. All right. Thank y'all for doing that. Let's do another question. So if you'll go to the next question, what's the possibility you envision in the system or the network that you're engaged in? In a phrase or a sentence, can you name the possibility you envision? Well, these are great. You'll take a minute to look at them. Connection and belonging, rich sharing, self-organizing, a shift in how we think, something specifically about the role of men is dramatically more life-giving and embracing the fuller spectrum of their humanity. Something about Gwinnett County. Wonderful. Thank y'all for doing that. And then one more, share with all of us, how familiar are you with social system mapping? Great. So we got a good mix. So this is wonderful. So look forward to sharing. I love that we have a good mix, and I'm sure that I'm hoping that we'll get to have you meet some people, and you'll be able to share across the more experienced people with maybe some of the less experienced people. All right, well, let me get on to what is social system mapping. And especially for you all that may be fairly new to social system mapping, I want to give you an idea of a few of the concepts and ideas that inform social system mapping and are really important to keep in mind. So one way we think of social system mapping is a mashup of several other types of maps. So many of these on the screen you may be familiar with. And I don't know about you, but when I think of these various types of maps, I could easily conclude that social system mapping is a product, but it's really a process more than a product. 10 years or so ago, I was using social network maps in a printed form, kind of as a product. And I was getting very little traction in my change efforts. And what I was missing are the process pieces that are part of social system mapping. So what I was finding is I would take these printed maps to the group that I was convening, that the people couldn't recognize themselves on this printed piece of paper that my colleague back in the office had created. It just didn't feel like it was something for them, a tool for them. But social system mapping is for everyone. And so it is online. So there's no more waiting for my colleague back at the office to print out the map. It's online and available to everyone. It's interactive so that everyone has the opportunity to poke around and play and ask questions and interact with the social system map. And it's accessible. So we all have access to the knowledge that it contains, not just a few of us, but we all can have the keys to the knowledge in the social system map. It's iterative, so we are constantly updating and adding, and it is changing. It's emergent, dynamic, and it is an invites us into a group or a collective practice of ongoing sense making. The purpose of social system mapping is to support a global movement to shift systems of dominance, exploitation, and extraction to systems of connection, reverence, and regeneration. I love how the words named in this shift captures the work that I've been engaged in the last 20 years in some form or another. And I imagine as you also reflect on these words, that you may find your life's work and purpose here as well. So social systems mapping is intended to support you and to help me and to help us all accelerate the systems shifting work we're already engaged in. As you've probably discovered in your work, there are two conditions that are required to shift systems of dominance, exploitation, and extraction to systems of connection, reverence, and regeneration. Strong networks of wise change agents, the two conditions. You're likely here because you already know that the types of intractable social problems facing us today require a network approach. And to have a strong network, you know that we need individuals who are watching and shepherding the network with intentionality and mindfulness. And together, as we show up in these Monday Zoom spaces that Christine convenes, we grow our individual and our collective capacity to be these wise change agents for the systems where we find ourselves. The increased capacity to be these wise change agents has us integrating two fundamental shifts, like into our being, into ourselves, while we also invite and nurture the network in these shifts. So two fundamental shifts that are important for us to get, but also to help our network or social systems to get. One is the relational shift. So particularly for those of us from the US, we've been conditioned in the myth of rugged individualism. And this relational shift that we need to make begins when we step outside that myth and recognize that we are not just solo actors, but we live and grow and fail and succeed in webs of connections with others. The second shift that's important to keep in mind is a cognitive shift, one from seeing the world in a mechanistic way, a linear cause and effect way, or an either or way, but to embracing a complex systems worldview. And when we embrace complexity thinking, we cannot always predict what will happen if we push lever A. And we become comfortable with emergence. In fact, we begin to look for and expect emergence. Either or gets replaced with both and so on. So while I just shared two shifts with you, this image reminds us that these shifts are really just two perspectives on the same thing. So at any given time, I might be attending to one, relationship shifting, or another, cognitive shifting, but we need both to happen. Shifting one impacts the other and vice versa. So we need to be explicitly attending to both shifts fully, and we need to look from both angles regularly and together. Social system mapping helps us make both these shifts, relational shifts and cognitive shifts. So I'm going to stop sharing now before we go into about a 5-minute breakout session where I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself to your breakout mates. Maybe share a challenge that you have currently in your network. And if there's time, share that possibility that you have in mind. But as I stop sharing, I want to just pause and see if Christine or Curtis have anything you want to add, or if among you there is just a burning question that needs to get answered before we proceed.
I thought that was great. I don't have anything to add. Thank you for that.
Ditto. I get it.
You get it. Wonderful. Kara, would you send us to breakout rooms for 5 minutes? All right, welcome back, everybody. We'll get another chance to do the breakout rooms and towards the end after Curtis leads us through some things as well. But I want to finish up this first half of our time together by talking a little bit about how the tools and processes of social system mapping can support systems transformation work. So some of you have seen the graphics that I'm about to use. And in fact, some of you were part of creating them, of which I am super grateful, because the first time I saw this presentation that I'm going to walk you through now, it was just like ding, 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 drop the mic. This captures my experience of social system mapping and my aspiration for it as well. So we start with people. People working on the ground, maybe in a city, maybe across the globe. They may be learning together, they may be in cohorts, but they may not even be aware of each other. And certainly there's probably no coordination happening. Some begin to sense that many of us are working toward a common purpose. And so we're experiencing our work toward this common purpose is kind of bringing us in closer proximity to others on the ground. We're kind of bumping into each other. And then a subset of us begins to sense that there is potential for increased impact if we could begin to connect more of us together. This group in the middle begins to set their intentions on gathering more and more of the field together. And so the core begins engaging others in convenings, they make introductions, they close triangles, and they help build and strengthen relationships. And that's what this orange is representing. It is the focus and attention that they're putting on that relational shift. After some months, in my experience, maybe even years of convening and relationship building, frustration can set in, because we experience that relationship building alone is not enough to significantly impact the system we're trying to change. The core starts to ask, how could we see our members and our connections, our network better? How might this visualization of our network help members take more agency, self-organize, and ultimately have greater impact toward our shared purpose? So they create a map. The data comes from the population, and then the data is available to the population. This is our first representation of a social system map. Here, up this side here, we're using SumApp as a data collection tool, allowing the people themselves to input their own information directly in the map. The data feeds into Kumu to create the visualization. And then the data about the members, their connections, and the visualization of this information is available to all of the members. And it's this system of activities that sets the conditions for even more relational shifts and for the cognitive shifts to begin to take hold. The core users of the map are using it to strengthen relationships, finding more ways to introduce people to each other. But often at this stage, the members of the map are using it maybe just for their own purposes, just to find somebody or some information that's going to serve their particular interest. But as the core begins to integrate the map more in the network activities, they might be spending more time with the members, helping them discover new and additional values of using social system map. They might be using the social system map to inspire their convenings or dialogues or learning that needs to happen together. And they're using the map to build a shared understanding of the network as they strategize together. And the core, if you've noticed, is beginning to add new members. The map is iterating. So as it iterates, we're getting better input from a wider range of members. The content of the map is changing, and the data is getting more aligned with the needs of our network. So these white lines that curve in toward the core, they represent that the data is getting more aligned with the purpose of the members and the purpose of the networks. So on this slide, if you'll notice, I got a little purple creeping in here. And the purple represents that cognitive shift that we talked about earlier. So now we've got the core and hopefully some of the members starting to use the map as a systems thinking tool. The core is helping the network practice complexity mindset. They're using the map for seeing, understanding, and influencing patterns, aka sense making. And all along, the network continues to inform and reform the content of the map so that the data becomes even more integrated with the values, the purpose, the identity of the network and its members. And you'll see even a more richness as we go of relationship building, of convening, of resources flowing, the purple representing a much stronger understanding of complexity and using the social system map for systems thinking. We're having an increased understanding across all sorts of important differences. The network starts understanding how the practice and the learning that they're gaining can be applied to the shift, the broader systemic shift that they're seeking, even beyond their little network. They're seeing beyond the network and really seeing the system and how what they're experiencing together can be applied broadly. As always, we keep iterating the map, and the data in the map become even more integrated into our activities until, and this is really key, the data, the map, the mindsets, the relationships, the actions are integrated and aligned. And that's what our final visual is representing. The system sees itself, it has self-awareness, it's a learning organization, and thus maximizing its transformational impact. So I will pause there. I love what some of y'all have created with that visual. It just captures so much, both my experience of working with social systems but also my aspirations for what is possible. So I'm going to pause now and see if Christine or Curtis have anything to add, or if we've got any questions right now, or anybody, also that want to add to what I've shared so far.
Well, I just want to appreciate all of the work or the effort or the attention or the intention that I see has been put into your understanding and explaining of the graphic. I really appreciate all of that effort, and I'm just really thrilled at how simple you made it and how at your delivery that was paced well enough to follow, because as we know, I can get really fast, and so it was lovely to hear it from your perspective. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And I loved how you put in how your experience in the past has been shifted by this way of seeing. And that it was interesting to get that personal background of your experience, and how it relates to this. Thank you. So super.
Else?
I was also going to say the same thing that Jim shared, so.
Thank you for the affirmation of all the time I put in. Curtis, I'm going to hand it off to you. And would you like me to share the screen and continue with the slides, or do you tell me when you're ready for me to share screen?
Yeah, why don't that'd be great. Why don't you go ahead and keep doing the share screen? And we should be on slide 54. Right.
Curtis, I don't have any numbers. Does
Oh,
this look right? Let me go forward.
actually, this is good. We should touch on this. So as we transition from thinking about social systems mapping in detail and how the mechanics of that work, both in the cognitive shift and in the relational shift, one of the things that we want to do is learn how to sort of dig in and pay attention to the elements, the dynamics that are happening within a human system. And sometimes looking at a map is assisted well by using other tools that we've learned through human systems dynamics, because it's complex systems. We're looking at a lot of moving parts. Every individual is a lot of moving parts, and all those individuals in relationship with each other and thinking differently is complex and changing all the time. So we want to look today at a tool called the difference matrix, which I think is the next screen, right? Yes. And the difference matrix is contained within the model that Amy led us through two times ago, called the CDE model, which stands for Container, Differences, and Exchanges. There's lots of different kinds of containers, and they're always sort of interacting with each other. And then within those containers are a lot of different elements, unique elements that are different from each other. And between those elements are exchanges being made back and forth of all kinds of different things. So let's look at a little bit closer at how those things can interact. So as far as containers are concerned, you can have different sizes of them that are more or less effective. Size doesn't necessarily mean, like, small doesn't necessarily, a small container, a constrained container doesn't necessarily mean that it's ineffective. You can shrink a container a little bit to highlight differences in exchanges, but it also, in some cases, will hide them. So one example of a container that might be constrained to ineffectiveness is using a boardroom full of people in suits and ties that are choking off blood flow to the brain to do a brainstorming session. That would be an example of a constrained container. The next slide, you can see that you can also have a container that's really large, and this can also be helpful as you explore differences in exchanges, but sometimes it's easy to get lost in the midst of that. Same thing can be true of differences. We can see on the next slide, you can focus on a very narrow set of differences if you want to highlight those. And that might be like uh, a good example of constrained differences that might be ineffective would be something like grandmas with walkers playing the high school wrestling team in a game of dodgeball. Does that make sense? The differences are too extreme. There's not enough differences there to balance it out. So same thing can be happening in the next, as we see in the next slide, differences can be, there can be so many differences that either it helps you discover differences that you can add to the container so that you can start to bring balance in the interactions within the system, or you can just lose sight because there's so many differences. Christine?
Can I offer a different version of constrained differences?
Sure.
I think what's meant there is that the differences are so small that they're not super relevant. So let's say we've got in this boardroom with, I'm going to add some more similarities. So we've got people in ties who are all white, all masculine. And the difference that we're thinking is relevant here is the 40-year-olds versus the 50-year-olds. We say, oh, that's a big difference. That's a generational difference. And we're really going to put a lot of our, like that's our idea of difference.
Right.
That's really small difference. And so I think that's what it means is the time when I was told this bank had a really diverse board and it was all white men from 50 to 60 with one female. And the differences that they thought were really, really relevant were the fact that some were ranch owners and some were bankers. And so they had this, slight work different, like professional field that they worked in, but they were all well-educated, all professional, all. And to me, that wasn't enough diversity to make a good word. So, yeah.
Agreed. Okay, so exchanges, same sorts of things. There can be too much of or too little. My example actually that I was thinking of is a group of middle-aged, middle-class white men trying to figure out how to solve sexism. Not enough opportunity for exchange there.
Can I reframe that one a little bit?
Sure.
It could be that what we're focusing on here is the exchange piece. So let's say we're trying to solve sexism and we've got too little diversity. That would be a smaller triangle on the differences angle. Exchanges, that might be that the exchanges are like once a year there's a newsletter. That's not enough exchanges. Or it might be, and this is where you're going to get to with the difference matrix, is it might be that all the exchanges are one way, like one side talking at the other side. And so it's about the how much information sharing or flow of anything is happening across the differences or within the container.
Right. So a likely scenario, and correct me if I'm wrong, would be that there would be lots of conversation about sexism, lots of exchange, but because or not very much to exchange because they all have the same perspective, they all have the same information. So there's just not that much going back and forth.
No, it could be, they could be talking all the time. They could be spending all day, every day talking about it. So that would be a lot of exchange.
Just not going anywhere.
But too little difference. So what we're looking at is the relationship between these three different sides of the triangle. And what you're focusing on is the difference. But what I'm focusing on is just the amount and the amount, quality, and frequency and directionality of the exchanges within the differences or across the differences. Does that?
All right. Well, I think I understand what you're talking about. And so I think we've covered this part well. This is the difference matrix. And there, as you can see, there's 4 quadrants. So in using this model, we are sort of focusing on these 2 different elements within the CDE model. And on the, in each quadrant, there's a way of recognizing what's happening. It gives us some sort of examples of what might be going on. In the next slide, it focuses on the emerging quadrant. So if there's a lot of exchange and a lot of differences that are within the exchanging that's happening, the differences in the elements that are in the container, and lots of exchanges, that's when we're going to see emergence, which can be very generative. It can be quite a lot of change, a lot of learning can happen, but this is also where within a container, there is risk for people's feelings to get hurt, or damaging ideas to come out, because there's so much conflict, possibility for things to get broken within the system because there's so much energy going on there. And then in the next slide, we see the low difference but high exchange. So this is what Christine was talking about in the last section. If it's a bunch of white men trying to solve sexism, there's not very much difference. But if there's lots of exchange, then they're just sort of staying in the same zone that they're always in. They're not able to see beyond. So not a lot of change. They're reinforcing each other's ideas. They may make themselves feel really good about their stance on sexism, but it doesn't produce anything. Can be boring, can be very exhausting because there's no new information coming in. So then on the low left quadrant, there's not a lot of exchange, but lots of difference. So this creates tension. Tension stays in the system because the exchange doesn't, the low exchange doesn't offer any place for the tension that exists between the high differences to go anywhere. So there might be internal change, but within the system, it sort of stays there because it's having a place to go. So it could feel safe. It could feel like we're protective. I know one of the examples that I saw about this was that Christine mentioned earlier was the racial tension that existed in our country in the 80s and 90s. That's much different than it is now. Things weren't talked about, and it sort of stayed in a behind the scenes sort of situation. But as we can see, as time went by, that ended up becoming somewhat explosive. So it did emerge later when differences were identified. And then in the lower right-hand corner is the resting quadrant, low difference and low exchange. This can be something you want to move a system to if it's been high exchange, high difference, and it's been volatile, or there's been a lot of tension. If you can focus on reducing differences and reducing exchanges, like for a season, to create rest, this is something that's good for us to do as individuals, is to take a step back from a system that we're in so we can experience stability, comfort, and relaxation and recharge. But we don't want to stay out of it too long. We don't want to keep systems in this place too long because they'll get stagnant and just lose sight of where growth needs to happen. Okay, so that's the difference matrix with its 4 quadrants. It's a really useful tool in analyzing different systems, and I want to practice that. I'd like to invite you to practice that with me together. How many of you have seen the video of the wolves being reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park? I'm hoping several of you have. Okay, it's been around for a while. Maybe we've seen it lots of different times. As I was pondering, like, what would be a good way for us to apply this difference matrix in an actual complex adaptive system, I think this is a really good story. So though you may have seen it before, I would guess you haven't been thinking of the difference matrix in in your brain as you're watching this video. So I want us to watch it. It's about a 4.5-minute video, and it's George narrating it. So we get to listen to a British voice and look at pretty pictures. But as you're watching, consider what's happening, where the system of Yellowstone National Park is prior to the wolves introduction and then after the wolves introduction, as well as recognizing that there are systems within systems. So the whole system might be moving to a particular part of the quadrant, but smaller elements, other containers within the system are moving in a different direction, and it's happening sort of simultaneously. So let's watch this video for a minute. It's the next slide, right, Amy? Okay, let's just watch this video for the next 4.5 minutes, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
Curtis, tell me if we don't hear sound, because I have not practiced playing a video from within Mentimeter. So I'll hit it now.
I'm not hearing sound.
Okay, let me, I'm gonna stop sharing and make sure I hit the audio when I share again.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Okay, there we go.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was a soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
All right. You can click to the next.
Okay.
Okay. So I just like to point out that George, the narrator, says that the wolves were the ones that changed the rivers. I really don't like it that he says it like that, because I feel like once the wolves were there, it allowed the entire system to find homeostasis. But in that process, as you can see, there's a lot of shifting around. If there was a difference matrix overlaid on Yellowstone National Park, the whole system was moving on the matrix, and containers within the system were moving on the matrix as well. So the question is, what quadrant of the difference matrix was Yellowstone in without the wolves? And then if you look at the difference matrix, what are the conditions that were created having removed the wolves from Yellowstone National Park? What was going on? What were the conditions that would fit into the area, the quadrant of the difference matrix that Yellowstone was in, minus the wolves? Does that question make sense? Okay.
So I'm guessing that Curtis, everybody's got the link to the Mentimeter, and you might have to scroll through to get to this question. Yeah, there we go. We've got some people that have, yes.
Yeah, you'll have to click through. That's right. And if you lost track of the link, Kara just put it in the chat also. And think too about some of the other systems, some of the smaller containers that were within Yellowstone National Park. So lots of different things were going on there. I'd be interested to hear what you think, like, and Christine, feel free to guide here. Like, one of the things that's being described is how the elk, which he calls deer the entire time, but the elk spending all of their time down at the riverbank had a significant impact within that container. So the river, the riverbank, the elk, the lack of the wolves, what quadrant would you say that that container was in, the riverbank container with the elk in it? What container was that in? Or what quadrant of the difference matrix was that container demonstrating? we're just talking about the bank itself and the elk.
I think it was low difference, low exchange.
You think so?
Mhm.
See, I would have thought it's high difference, high exchange, and created a destructive situation. Because there's a big difference between the elk and the riverbank in that container.
Right, but there are only a couple of beings in that sub niche. There's only the river and the elk. And there
Right.
aren't beavers and rabbits and roots. There's just so the elk, it's a very low diversity environment because there aren't
Right.
a lot of other animals, and their exchange is basically one way, which is the elk are consuming what they find there. And that consumption isn't going into any other beings. It's just eroding. So this is this low difference, low exchange area can be also really destructively just extracting, because there's only a one-way flow, like the elk are consuming, and nothing else is being able to do anything with the energy, the biomass that they consume.
I was
I agree
thinking
with-
go ahead.
I agree with Christine on that, particularly given that you defined the container. The container that you want us to look at was, in fact, the elk at the riverbank.
Mhm.
In that container, there is low difference and low exchange. But if you widen the container, then you have a different set of differences.
And so just to point out, a difference could be the differences within a container, like at the riverbank, there's the difference between the riverbank and the elk. And then, but there's also differences across containers. So like what's going on at the riverbank as they bring in the wolves, they're adding sort of more containers to a larger container. They're adding, so there's more activity going on across, the upper wooded area and the riverbank and more animals. I mean, so you can define containers, and you can define differences from all kinds of angles. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I was just thinking in terms of how big the difference was between the elk and that is the extremeness of their difference.
Yeah.
But I see what you're saying in terms of like the exchange not being equal makes it extractive.
Well, so I see where that's coming from, and that makes a lot of sense. And the way the CDE model works, or the way often systems, when people are talking about complex living systems, they're not generally talking about the size of the continuum of the differences. They're talking about the number of differences. So it's more or less differences as opposed to more or less difference, which is another kind of dimension. But generally, when we're talking about self-organizing systems, we're talking about what's the container, how many differences are there in the container, how many just different, and how many ways can we look at these differences? Because seeing more differences, like seeing from ecosystem to, niche to niche, or kind of being to kind of being, whatever, like looking for more dimensions on difference, and then the exchanges across them that's what creates a self-organizing system, is enough differences, enough exchanges within a bounded enough container that a doll just doesn't float off into space.
Well, this brings up a whole bunch more thoughts in my head, but I don't want to explore them right now.
And Curtis, do you see Curtis Willard has raised his hand?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, it turns out this social system mapping is a lot more fun than I thought. And the conversation we're having now is probably, actually not time to have it, because one of the things that it just occurred to me that I often talk to people about this, concept of emergence by quoting the old saying about the butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon rainforest. And so, if we look at that, we can say, well, how much difference does that make? If you look at the other end, when those dynamics end up being a hurricane,
Yeah.
Off the coast of Florida, it makes a big difference. But it's it's low at that point in the rainforest. It's low exchange there. So that's one thing. The other thing I think that's really important, and that I thought about when we started talking about this, is that we really have to drill down on the sort of social dominant narrative, that we are, I want to say trapped in, but actually involved in, which is sort of binary and low context. And so part of this discussion we're talking about now is context. When Christina said, well, what scale you look at, what scale are we looking at? And what is the nature of the exchange, and in this society, I'll say this and stop, but on all things, our greatest strength is our greatest weakness. And one of the great strengths that allow us to sit here now around the country or the world looking and listening to each other is this low context, binary, mechanistic approach. But being able to step outside of that when we start talking about social systems, which aren't mechanical, is a major challenge.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, let's look at I want to ask the same question, only in terms of what happened when the wolves were reintroduced. And I think now we're looking at a system where there's a lot of exchange and a lot of difference. And what were some of the things that showed up? What were the conditions that were created by those exchanges and differences? And he lists a whole bunch of different ones, if you remember them. I love the way that he says quintupled. So I've watched this video hundreds of times. The tree's quintupled in 6 years. And again, in this one, there's a whole bunch of different containers. What I think is really interesting about this occurrence, so this is a system that got messed up because of human interference and then accidentally put back to rights also because of human involvement. Not the guy who put the wolves there was not trying to balance the ecosystem. He just figured it was a great place for wolves. But it had this unintentional positive effect that spread throughout the entire system. And I think one of the temptations is when we're guiding and shepherding human systems, is to try to figure out what is the wolf? What's the one lever that we can push on that's going to fix everything? And that's why I don't like the way that he says that, because I feel my sense is that in every system, there's a whole bunch of levers working together. And that's why it's so important that there is lots of exchange between lots of different elements. Okay, so we've now watched passively as Yellowstone National Park has restored itself and the system came into a healthy place that was beneficial for all elements. We're going to take a risk here. I'm going to take a risk here. And I want to try to do this ourselves. I'm trying to figure out how to guide a system. It's a small container with, I think, enough possibility for exchange and difference to write the system. And this is the system that I want us to practice this on. And then we're going to go into small groups after this, after we practiced a little bit, and talk about how we could do this in the systems and networks that we're in. So here's the system that I want to introduce. The first half of it is this. If you go to the next slide, Amy. This is half of it. This is a tug of war system. And then click to the next slide. This is the other half. Okay, so hopefully you could see the container, the differences, the exchanges. Obviously, in this case, there's a big difference between one side of the system and the other side of the system. There's an effort at a particular kind of exchange, and this system is not hitting homeostasis, right? This team right here is probably just going to get dragged through the mud. So if we think of this as a very simple system, a small container, what are some things that we could do to alter the dynamics that are happening in here, to move from one quadrant to another and bring balance to this? Does that make sense? You understand what I'm asking us to do? If we get creative, we're sort of a godlike, presence in this system. What can we adjust that will bring the system to a more healthy and positive state?
Do you want those in the Mentimeter?
Yeah, sorry, that's the next slide in the Mentimeter.
Okay.
Now you can change anything you want. It doesn't have to be realistic. This is sort of playing here. What could we do if you could do anything you want? And feel free to holler out to say stuff verbally as well as use the Mentimeter if I'm happy to think out loud together. Okay. Change the activity completely. Yeah. I can see, like, if we changed it to like finger painting, those two kids would probably be significantly more proficient. Yeah, take some of the people from the big giant hulking team and move them over to the other team. So the exchange was more balanced. There we go. Tilt the field. To have a role in lifting it. There we go. Yeah. I thought you could make the big team, have them stand on a soapy slip and slide. Or tie giant weights around the two kids, although that could have some disastrous effects as well. I think the rope had a piece of tape around it. The winner is the one who resists Is that resist the longest?
Resist the least.
Oh, oh, there you go. Change the rules of the game. That's a good Captain Kirk approach. Yeah, the activity is itself is a very singular exchange. I'm trying to simplify this down so we can wrap our brains around it. Maybe just so I could wrap my brain around it. So I appreciate you going with me on this journey. All right. Okay, well, there's some different things. I think there's lots of adjustments that can be made. One of the, I think, is the next slide. The next slide is the.
This is what came up, Curtis. I don't know if this is what you wanted.
Yeah. So just
Yeah.
thinking about, can you click and look back at the slide that has the difference matrix on it?
May
Yeah.
find a matrix.
Yeah. What was helpful to me in studying this and learning about this is looking at the matrix as something that you can move down on or up on, or you can move left or right on. So anytime we're in a situation where we're trying to guide and shepherd a system, we're looking at an actual social system. As we change our focus or introduce dynamics, we can move ourselves toward emergence by increasing exchange and increasing difference both. And we can introduce one or the other and move in different places on the map. So if we are in an emergent place, but we're experiencing danger and conflict and destruction, then we might want to pause and adjust the differences or refocus, lower them or reduce them in some way, or adjust the exchanges so that we can pause and shift so that we can go back towards emergence in a more generative, helpful way. Does that make sense? Jim?
I'm thinking if you had a nice mix of exchange and difference, but the container's too loose, then might you also think about sizing the container so that you start getting the heat that you want for real emergence.
Yeah.
Well, or vice versa, an example that came to me earlier is you could have high difference and high exchange could be being very dangerous because the container is way too tight. I'm thinking of like a prison system where right now there's some very polarized beings in that system, and they have nothing to do but exchange with each other all day long, and it's really hazardous for them in there. And so giving them some more space, making a bigger container and allowing them, places to be different together and not have to be exchanging constantly across differences. So the container can also be sized is a big point that Jim's making is useful.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Okay. I want to take a couple of minutes, 10 minutes in small groups. Think of a system that you're in, a network that you are part of, and spend a few minutes talking about how you can use the difference matrix to shift what's going on, shift the dynamics in your network. And then we'll come back and talk about it briefly. Let's do 8 minutes because I see that we're getting close to the time. Welcome back, everybody. How were what were some of the networks or systems that you are working on that you are applying this to?
Well, I'm always thinking about it in relation to this community of practice.
I'm sure you are 24 hours a day.
Yeah. And my context is lay leaders in faith-based organizations.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that Justin and I are doing together with men across the country is actually trying to get them to pay attention to and create containers where they're already at. So helping them see how they can create an emergence within small containers in different parts of the country that we're not overseeing, which is a challenge. Well, any other thoughts, questions, comments as we're closing down before we have announcements?
I just had a quick question. Did these slides, did you all create these slides, or did these come from the Human Systems Dynamics folks? They're a nice package.
Go ahead, Christine.
The ones with the CDE, the different sizes of the CDE triangles and the difference matrix come from HSD. So anything that's applied HSD content came from HSD, and then the rest is ours.
Yeah, the tug of war stuff, I made that myself.
Should we go to announcements?
Yeah, thanks everybody. Who was in charge of announcements today? Okay, thank God it's not me. I don't know what they are.
It's not you. I've got them for you. We have our typical community of practice sessions coming up on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Mondays of the month, which will be your sense-making session like today in May, and our on-ramp session for next week. And then the 3rd Monday will be our deep dive. And then for our, we kind of have an alternating quarterly session that happens on the 4th Monday. And this 4th Monday is going to be our community building session. And those are a great chance to get to know each other and kind of spend time in community with one another, learning about each other more kind of outside of this context, but maybe what you're doing in your networks. And I will share a couple of links really quick here, but you will also get email announcements for those. And that should cover announcements.
Right. Thank you, everybody. Any further input? Amy, Christine, anybody before we unmute and wave and say goodbye?
I just wanted to make sure we weren't going to miss our goodbye rituals. So yeah, that's all I had.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. If you could just unmute and then make generous gestures with your hands and voices to say goodbye, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much,
It's good to see
everybody.
you
Bye.
all.
Have a wonderful rest of your week.
All right.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.